to another episode of Rising Tide. The purpose of Rising Tide is to educate, heal, and empower by bringing on the world's most brilliant minds and purest souls. So I am humbled and honored to have a great Rising Tide in the building by the name of Ray Montagno. He was one of my professors going back to college days. I think during that time, you were actually the director over sales and marketing at Ball State, correct?
Yes, I was the chair of the department, right.
So if we want to just start off with just who you are and what it is that you do. I know you're retired now, but what it is that you used to do?
Sure. I had actually quite an interesting career. Started out, my undergraduate degree was in mechanical engineering, and I worked for a manufacturing company for about 5 or 6 years. And after that, I had taken a course in industrial organizational psychology at Butler University many years ago, and really liked it. And after working for a manufacturing private sector company for a while, I decided to try my hand in academics, and I left my job and went back to grad school. Eventually got a PhD in industrial organizational psychology from Purdue, and took a job my first job was at Bowling Green State University in Ohio. And from there I moved to Ball State and kind of worked my way through the academic ranks. Started out as assistant professor and eventually ended up as a department chair. And then I was associate dean for the College of Business for about 8 years. And then I went back to the marketing management department as chair. Along the way, I actually had kind of an interesting decision to make. At one point, we had a person we had hired to run our international programs, and that person ended up leaving, and we needed somebody to take over our international programs, so I kind of volunteered to do that, and that was probably one of the best decisions I ever made in my life. And as a result of that, I got to do quite a bit of traveling. I've been to 30 different countries around the world, and spent probably, I think if you added up all the time I spent outside the United States, probably well over a year and a half living outside the borders of the United States. I lived in England for a semester, lived in Germany for a semester, and then took students on probably 10 or more study abroad trips for a couple of weeks at a time. So I got to do a lot of interesting things along the way during my career.
Oh, that's kind of cool. So in your experience with being over sales and marketing, and you had said management too, right?
Yes. Yeah, in the last job I had, the marketing and management department at Ball State was combined, so I was a chair of that. It was a big department. We had 24 or 5 faculty members and about 15 grad students. So
what is the role of, what was your day-to-day responsibilities or activities as the chairman?
So primary role of a chair is to make sure all our classes are staffed with qualified faculty, make sure that faculty are kind of meeting the goals of the department in terms of the meeting the academic requirements of each major. So, in a big department like that, we had several different sub-majors and so forth. So chair's job really is to kind of make sure that, each of these majors is meeting the kind of the requirements of the university. Every college nowadays, doesn't really matter whether you're in business school, but you have to maintain accreditation. So part of that is to make sure that all the pieces in terms of content for classes and so forth are being fulfilled. Getting faculty to kind of do the paperwork is one of the major jobs. As you might imagine, faculty see themselves as sort of independent contractors, and getting them to kind of do all the paperwork is kind of a mundane but important task that has to be done. And then, of course, we have to evaluate faculty for promotion purposes and salary purposes, and keeping track of all that paperwork is part of the job as well.
So as your position, did a lot of outside businesses come to just get experience or ideas on how they could market or manage or sell better?
Sure. So the one of the kind of strategy that Ball State in general has put in place is the outreach to the business community. And so we have any number of projects where students work with outside businesses. Teams of students will get a client, and these are generally outside of classes. So these could be separate projects where students will work with an outside client. Client will identify a problem they need to have solved, and students then work with that client over the course of a semester to analyze the problem and come up with a set of recommendations to solve that problem. There have been a couple of very interesting ones. I know one of our faculty members worked with the Kurt Vonnegut Library to look at their kind of marketing and promotion activities in downtown Indianapolis. And so that was kind of a fun project that I'm aware of.
No, that's pretty cool. So in your experience, what holds most people or most organizations back when it comes to any of really the areas of your focus, either management, sales, or marketing?
Well, I would guess that most businesses fall into bad habits. Some of them fall into good habits, some of them fall into bad habits. And I think kind of this is a cliche, but this is the way we've always done it kind of mentality is in place in a lot of businesses. And so I think kind of stepping outside your comfort zone to bring in new ideas is probably one of the most difficult things for, especially businesses that have been established for quite a while.
How much do you feel ego gets in the way of a new business owner when it comes to hindering his growth or receiving new ideas from the outside?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think one of the reasons businesses are successful, of course, is because oftentimes you have a strong founder who puts his or her heart and soul into making this business successful to start with. And so as businesses grow, oftentimes it outgrows the ability of that founder to kind of manage all the intricacies of a larger enterprise. And so at that point, whether it's ego or whether it's just not understanding that I no longer can control all these elements. I remember talking to a founder of a business in Muncie a number of years ago, and he was kind of complaining. He said, when I started this business, I knew everybody. I knew everybody that came in the door. I was involved in hiring everybody, and when we got past 100 employees, now we're up to 500 employees. He said, I don't know everybody, and I'm not sure how my establishment of the culture of the business is still functioning. And so he was a little frustrated because of that kind of change in the nature of the business that he no longer had control over. And he was a smart enough guy to realize that, maybe that wasn't a good thing for him to be in control of everything, but he found it frustrating. And I think for a lot of founders, giving up that control is a very, very difficult thing to do.
Giving up control and being able to delegate to responsible parties. So how do you, or in your experience, what has been some of the best ways to filter if you're delegating or giving up control to a qualified party or somebody that's going to I guess, do it proper, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a formula for that. I think the real decision has to come from inside that founder, that manager, that they have to recognize that if I want to grow, I have to give up some of that control and bring in people that may be smarter than I am. And oftentimes when a company has a board of directors, sometimes that board of directors can be instrumental in making that happen. That the board then will kind of move the founder aside and bring in a professional manager that can, I know a lot of times if a small company is looking to get outside funding from a venture capitalist or so forth, that funder may require that the founder step aside and they bring in a professional CEO or CFO to kind of manage the company and move the founder into what they're really good at, maybe in product development or service delivery. So
that's
oftentimes
smart.
is really the solution there.
Huh. How often would you say that happens where I guess it's good that the venture capitalist is able to see that maybe this isn't the best people person, and let's just put him in an area in which he can really thrive, which, like you said, is probably product development or something like that. How often does that happen where the idea person isn't suitable to actually run the business?
Just anecdotally, it's probably always true.
Wow.
And the reality that it doesn't happen every time, and not every business always seeks out outside money that's going to kind of force them to make a change. If we look at the number of new businesses get formed every year, the numbers in the hundreds of thousands, and we know from data that a large percentage of those are gone after 5 years. And so you probably could make the argument that the ones that are gone probably weren't able to kind of make that transition, to bring in the kind of people necessary to make the business successful. Oftentimes there's other problems, cash flow problems and so forth, but any number of reasons why all those new startups go out of business. But you can even look at huge companies that, for whatever reason, weren't able to kind of recognize the changes taking place in the environment. I mean, we have classic cases like Kodak and Blockbuster and so forth, that are companies that weren't able to make that transition because they weren't able to see changes in the environment, and the existing management wasn't able to kind of let go of their beliefs about the way the world worked. And they're now either a shadow of what they used to be or out of business completely. We can look at, more current examples like Sears and all these retail giants of the past and wonder, what were they thinking when they saw Amazon on the horizon or Walmart and so forth. And, Walmart is now probably one of the more successful at kind of managing this transition. They still have big brick and mortar footprints, but they're also recognizing that they're going to have to be online. And so, whatever you think of Walmart, plus positive or negative, the fact is that they're being pretty successful about meeting that challenge of online retailing.
Yeah, no, that's very, very true. So one thing that I've always been very impressed with you by is your ability to be able to handle people. I remember when we were running Real Impact for Student Entrepreneurs back in the day, RISE program, and it was me, you, and it was two ladies that we were running the program with, and we were out getting breakfast or something, and they were scowling me for basically my selection of book choice. And I remember just feeling just attacked. And I remember afterwards they got up and you just kind of walked away, and I looked at you and I was like, man, that's crazy, right? And you just was like, huh. and it didn't bother you and it didn't affect you at all, nor did you let their energy, you didn't reciprocate it. And that image always stuck in my mind of just like, anytime I felt like I was under persecution or something, like just be as cool as like Ray was in that moment. Cause you just, it literally didn't seem like it bothered you at all. You were still able to communicate with them. You didn't like have an attitude towards them, even though their tone was kind of off. So I kind of want to talk about or ask your perspective on just dealing with people in like hostile situations. Is that something that's just you learned throughout your training, or was that just like a quality that was like innate within you, or?
Yeah, well, I probably can attribute that to my mother. My mother was the calmest person you've ever met in your life, and never never took things personally. And I think oftentimes when you experience people in any kind of setting, whether it's a work setting, a social setting, that if they're exhibiting some behaviors that may be negative, maybe feel like they're personal attacks, there's probably something else going on with them that it's really not about you. It's about something else that's causing that. And so, I've learned over the years that it never does any good to kind of reciprocate anger with anger and or aggressiveness even. Now, certainly, I believe people need to be assertive. If you have a strong opinion and you have data to kind of back up what your belief is, then you certainly need to be assertive about what your beliefs are. But if, in fact, the kind of the situation you're in isn't that important, I mean, it's not going to change the world whether you're right or not, then it really doesn't do a whole lot of good to kind of get too bent out of shape about something that somebody else might be saying. I guess there's pros and cons to that. I mean, sometimes you may end up being perceived as kind of a pushover, and people can run roughshod over you. On the other hand, you have to kind of look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and say, is what I did yesterday how I want to be perceived in the world? And if it's not, then you need to behave differently than you did the day before. So I've always kind of viewed my interactions with people as, how do I want to be treated by other people? And I want to treat people that way. And so that's sort of has been my guiding principle.
No, that's a great guiding principle. So so a two-part question. One is like, so how do you hold people accountable by still maintaining that philosophy? And then also, how do you reprimand people without conflict escalating?
Yeah, so I had, as I said before, I was running a department that had 22 to 25, depending on the year it was, kind of smart, independent faculty members. And they're, I don't know, well, you've got experience with college professors, and they all think everything they know is the exact way the world runs, and they don't understand why everybody's not listening to them. And so I had a number of experiences with faculty members that were kind of expressing their opinion about what's right and what's wrong. And so my usual strategy was, I'll listen to what you have to say. Here's what I think about this particular situation. If it's in strong disagreement with what they had to say, I usually, if they maintained their cool, we'd have this discussion and we'd agree to disagree on that situation. If they got angry and were insisting on their point of view, I would generally ask them to kind of stop talking at that point and say, let's think about this for a day and come back and talk about it again. So I never thought when things got heated that a solution was going to come out of that particular meeting. So I'd always kind of say we're going to come back and talk about this again in the future. And it almost always was true that once they cooled down a little bit, came back to talk about it, they realized that this wasn't getting them where they wanted to go. And we often would end up in a more productive situation. Sometimes I would have to bring in a third party, maybe my boss, to kind of make a decision about this. But generally speaking, I found that if you kind of didn't reciprocate with getting upset, and you're always going to be much further ahead in the long run. Now, people always didn't get what they wanted, and I always didn't get what I wanted. So, sometimes, they were right and I was wrong, and I had to kind of admit that. And I'd have to go back and change the decision I had made. But, you got to always be open to changing your mind. If you're not open to changing your mind at some point, then you're never going to kind of have good relationships with people that you're working with.
No, I agree completely. Must stay open to changing your mind. Those are facts. So in your perspective and in your experience, what would be like the top 3 or 4 qualities that you've seen in like great managers? And then conversely, what would be the top like 3 or 4 qualities you consistently see in managers that underperform or just fail outright?
Yeah, okay. So I think kind of the qualities that are really important are being willing to talk to people. I mean, if you find yourself in a position where you think somebody's engaged in some kind of activity or behavior that isn't working, and you never talk to them, then that's never going to change. So kind of being open and willing to engage with people is probably the most important thing. Second thing is you have to have some, vision of what you think your organization should look like, whether it's a small department or whether it's a whole organization. But you have to have some kind of picture of what you want the culture, I think maybe is the phrase I'm looking for here, is how do you want people to interact in this environment? And if you don't know how you want people to interact with each other, then there's no way it's ever going to be in a positive way for you. So, I know that in a large university like there were 50 some odd departments, and it was clear what different departments looked like. I mean, you talk to people around campus and you could see that, there were some departments that had very good cultures. People spoke with each other. They were productive and high performing departments. And others, where the manager, one of the problems in management, especially in universities, is that people end up in managerial roles by default sometimes. Nobody else wanted to do it, and so they end up being a department chair, whether they wanted to or not, and they would just saw this as it's my turn and I got to put in my 3 years or 5 years, and then I'm moving on. And they had never had any interest in being a department chair or manager, and the result of that is they never worked at it. They never said, well, what do I got to do to be successful in this job? So you have to, in a sense, have a vision for where you want to go with your department or your particular position. That's true in private industry as well. People end up in managerial roles because they're very good at and this is kind of a cliche, but they're good at what they're doing, and they get promoted into a job they're not so good at. And there's a famous book from many years ago called The Peter Principle. And a lot of people are familiar with that book. People rise to their level of incompetence. And you end up in a job that you're incompetent. And there's reasons people take those positions because they higher status, better pay, and so forth. But they get in there and they realize that, hey, I'm not very good at this. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm going to continue to do it because of, all those characteristics that come with it, better pay, and, as I said, status. So, so, having some kind of picture of how you want your job to go and what it means to be successful in that is really, I think, important. And, third is, I think, being able to trust people. If I have people working for me and I don't trust them for whatever reason, I can't, and this goes back to letting go of that control that we talked about earlier. If I don't trust people to actually do their jobs without me looking over their shoulder, then you're probably never going to be very successful. You're going to be frustrated, for one thing, because people are not going to enjoy that kind of relationship they have with you. And secondly, they're not going to be very productive because they're always going to be kind of looking over their shoulder, seeing somebody watching me, and they're never going to take risks to kind of make things better.
In what ways, in your experience, what are some ways in which people could increase their ability to trust people, to operate with a level of competence?
Well, sure. So if you give people a chance to give them an assignment, for example, and kind of, give them some parameters for it, but just not always be checking in with them, So say you give somebody an assignment with a deadline, then, wait and see what happens. Don't be checking in with them every week and say, hey, how's things going on this project? There are ways to do that that are probably more productive than others. Making sure that people, when you give somebody a job to do, and you don't give them the resources to do it, then that's probably a guarantee for failure. So, the way you trust people is you make sure they have the resources to do the job, and then kind of get out of their way and let them do it.
Oh, that's true. Yeah. I'm just writing down what you're saying.
So I kind of want to maybe digress a little bit here. I think one of the things that kind of brings additional kind of interest to work is if you can give people an opportunity to kind of see things outside their own narrow job. One of the biggest problems I think people have is when an organization comes up with a set of strategic goals and objectives and so forth. When these kind of filter down to somebody doing their job, and this person doing their job doesn't see how what I'm doing connects with the larger organization, I think that can be a problem as well. One of the things that always kind of surprised me about university college professors is they didn't see how their job fit with the overall education of students. We have, I don't want to pick on a particular major, but let's just say accounting. Well, if you talk to accountants, what they would want is they want every student to take as many accounting courses as possible, and don't see how that fits in with the overall education of the student. Students, they don't need to take history, they don't need to take more English classes and so forth. And they maybe can't, for whatever reason, recognize that the job of a university professor is to educate a student to be a citizen, a global citizen and not just an accountant. Being an accountant is important. I'm not suggesting that's not important, but they need to kind of figure out, well, how does this role as an accountant fit in with their role as a as a citizen later on after they get out of school. We did a study one time of CEOs, and we asked them a question. We said, what are you looking for in a student right after they graduate from college? And they had all these very specific things, and job skills and blah, blah, blah. And then we said, now, what do you want this person to look like 10 years down the road? And they were much more expansive in terms of their ability to see problems from many different perspectives and so forth. So it was like there was this inherent conflict built into what CEOs were expecting of their employees. They wanted these narrow, task-focused people when they hired them, but by the time they were looking at them 10 years down the road, they wanted them to have much broader perspective on the world and organizational success and performance. And so maybe the problem that accounting professors have is reflective of the same problem CEOs have with what they're expecting from their employees the day they hire them versus what they want from them 10 years down the road. So
that's interesting, though, because it seems like it should have been switched, where it seems like it should have started off, I guess, more broad and then kind of narrowed in and got more specific as they developed within the company. But you're saying that they started off kind of super specific, and then by the time they got developed within the company, they expected them to be more broad and more general.
Yeah, because at that point, they want them to kind of be able to look at problems from a much broader perspective rather than their narrow kind of disciplinary focus.
No, that's fascinating. And so with that study that you have brought up, outside of like job skills, what were some of the things that companies are looking for when a person does graduate freshly from a university?
Well, the kind of the classic one that everybody says they want somebody with good communication skills. And
what does that mean? I know that's kind of vague, but what exactly does that mean?
Yeah, I always laugh at behavior because that's exactly the question you're asking is, what does that mean? Typically speaking, when they first get hired, it probably means that, can they talk about their specific job function? Can they communicate the specifics of what they're doing to other people in the organization? And can they understand the kind of the directives that are given to them? And can they express the problems that they're experiencing in their job to other people in that kind of narrow area of their work? Later on, when you talk about communications, you're really talking about, I think I mentioned this before, how do you communicate the goals and objectives of the organization to the internal audience, but also to an external audience? So if I'm a dean in a college, talking from my own experience here, but I was associate dean for a while, and my job requirements were me to meet people outside the organization. So how do I express to people outside the organization what the goals and objectives of the university are, and how do I take those inputs from outside and bring them back into the university to communicate those to people inside? And so, your communication skills become really kind of multifaceted there in terms of kind of understanding communications from outside your narrow workplace, and communicating them to people inside, and taking what's inside and communicating it to people outside. And doing that, we probably do that verbally more than in written form, but there are those in the organization that have to do it in written form as well. So verbal communication skills are clearly important. Good grammar, I was just talking about that in a kind of a pretty specific sense, I think is important. If we look at people who have opportunities to speak to other people, it's good grammar seems like a given, but it's certainly one of the first things people notice about others when they're speaking is what their grammar is like. If they make a lot of grammatical errors and so forth, and I know there's a lot of common grammatical errors that have become part of the vernacular nowadays, but that's certainly an important issue in terms of communication skills. I recall we did a project one time for a new young CEOs organization, and they were interviewing some of our students. It's good practice interviews. I brought some of my students down to this meeting, and we're just using them as, I hate to use the word guinea pigs, but they were just practicing the interview skills, and the kids got an opportunity to practice their interview skills as well. But I recall afterwards that one of the CEOs I was talking to, were talking about their experience with the students, and he made this comment. He said, "Well, this one student had good grades and seemed to know what he was talking about, but he had kind of a NASCAR accent." And I was like, "What?" That really surprised me, but he noticed that. And so it's I think, important for students and anybody to recognize that you're getting judged by the way you communicate, and grammar and style. I think those is kind of culturally biased, and oftentimes they are. We grow up in a particular environment. I grew up in New York, and everybody notices when somebody has a strong New York accent, and so it's these are things that we need to recognize. And if we, there's two ways to think about that. If I'm somebody that has kind of an accent, maybe I need to kind of work on improving that. On the other hand, if I'm an evaluator, I need to recognize maybe I'm being biased against somebody because of that, and that isn't who they are. It's just something that maybe they have grown up in, and they have very little control over it. What your accent is. I mean, if people from the South, obviously they have an accent. And in fact, I had a company I worked for. I had this regional manager who was from Alabama. He had a strong Southern accent. He told me one time that he had actually gone to classes to kind of polish his accent, to kind of get rid of his Southern accent. So, these are, we talk about communication skills. Maybe I'm going on a little too long talking about
No, I'm vibing with you completely. Actually, I remember I was watching a TV show called The Wire, and it had Idris Elba on there, and so I didn't know he was from London until probably 5 years later. I had seen him do an interview, and then I heard him speak in his natural tone, and I was so surprised because he sounded American from all the years that I've seen him on TV. I had no idea that he was a foreigner. So I agree that there are ways in which people can work on their tones or eliminate accents, or I think acting is a good profession that will help with that. As you were speaking, a few things came to my mind. The first thing is, how much does biases, and I know they're unconscious, but how much does biases and like stereotypes interfere when it comes to managing other people? And are managers trained to be aware of biases more than non-managers?
Yeah, well, that's a real important question today, especially with some of the things going on in society. And, so the question is, where does bias come from to start with? Children learn biases, in all different kinds of ways. And so we bring ourselves to any environment, a work environment, a social environment. And this is a long history of educational formation that we bring to these environments. And so training obviously is important. I mean, there's all kinds of inherent bias training that is taking place nowadays, and lots of organizations are doing it. Certainly we hear about it from police departments and so forth that are trying to do something about inherent biases that may be in existence. The question of whether we can actually train biases out of people, this is a really hard question to answer, and I wish I could have a definitive statement about it. Just to give you, this is a kind of almost a funny example, but I was interviewing a faculty member several years ago for a human resource management faculty member position. And this woman had done her dissertation on looking at biases in people. And this was just a small part of her study, but it was one that has stuck with me. And she was looking at whether people that had visible tattoos created biases. Was there a bias against people that had visible tattoos in the hiring process? And as you might imagine, there were. That people who viewed people with tattoos felt them to be less trustworthy. Well, so maybe we could predict that might be the outcome. But a secondary finding she had was that people who had tattoos even trusted people with tattoos less. Which was like, oh, that's very surprising outcome there. But the interesting part of that to me was that this bias then against tattoos, and I don't think that's a protected class under our federal laws of having a tattoo, but it was just kind of interesting that this is a bias. Even the person who got a tattoo, had a tattoo, turned out to have this inherent bias against people with tattoos. And so, going back to your question about biases, this is, really, many of these biases are kind of engendered in our society for hundreds of years. I'm in the process of reading a book right now called Caste, written by an African-American woman, and looking at sort of the inherent biases that really are part of American culture dating back hundreds of years, to think about how we might change those things in a short time frame of 10, 20 years is, I think, a tremendous challenge. And certainly admission of bias in all forms, whether it's religious, racial, and so forth, is going to require a tremendous amount of leadership on the part of politicians, business owners, and so forth, and people in all walks of society to start with. So, that's maybe sounds like a simple question, but it becomes one of tremendous intricacy in terms of making change in society.
Yeah, I was reading a book called No One Knows You and What to Do About It, or No One Understands You. I think it's called No One Understands You and What to Do About It. Fascinating read on just perception. And in it, it was talking about different unconscious biases that we have. She was also referring to them as perceptual lenses that we put on. Like, for instance, she was talking about like a power lens that certain people have on. So anytime there's been like a real powerful person in the room, sometimes people can notice that he doesn't, or he or she doesn't really make eye contact with everybody in the room. And certain people feel like, oh, he just acts like I just doesn't exist. But it's actually a bias that or at least from what the book said, that when people are in this, when they have their power lens on or in this power mindset, that they're really only seeing things that's directly connected to what they want. So if you aren't displaying any attribute that pops up in their awareness, oh, this can help me get to my goal, they're not, it's not that they're trying to ignore you, but they literally don't see you at all.
Mhm.
They're just not paying attention to it. And so she went down a whole bunch of different biases and everything that we had, like the primacy effect, which is you typically remember people based upon first impressions, which is why parents still see you as little kids, even though, you know, you might be 30 years old, but in their mind, they still see you as when you were just a little infant that
Sure.
couldn't take care of yourself. Or the halo effect, which is if you, the first impression you get of somebody is like a good impression, you tend to just see only good things from them. You filter out a lot of bad things from them. So I'm extremely fascinated when it comes to just biases. I think the brain is fascinating. And like you said, I thought that was fascinating that even people who had the tattoo still displayed the bias themselves. Yeah, so I just find all that fascinating. That's amazing.
Yeah. And, it's really, human beings have natural tendencies to do this. I mean, it's a survival mechanism. I mean, you can't attend to everything in your environment. I mean, you'd go crazy if you had to attend to everything and every characteristic. So, as a heuristic, what we do is we create these categories and put people and things, not just people, but things in categories to kind of save our mental energy. If we had to attend to everything, every individual characteristic of everything all the time, we'd go crazy. And so it's in a sense, a way for us to kind of manage our environments. Now, unfortunately, what that does is that we make mistakes when we do that. And by using those categorization techniques, we oftentimes with people will put them in the wrong categories or make the wrong decisions about them because of those kind of labor-saving or mental energy-saving activities. And so, becoming aware of those things is really important. And, we say, all right, which of these things is not working for me? And if I'm become aware of the ones that aren't working for me and I can fix those and not have to worry about everything, then you probably, and that maybe is what training can do for us, help us to kind of recognize the ones that maybe don't work for us as well as they should and fix those.
No, that's powerful. And then another thing that kind of triggered in my mind as you were speaking a while back was personality tests. Is personality test something that you've seen a lot of managers use? And if so, do you find personality tests effective when it comes to really typecasting a person, or I guess determining what a person's mindset is like and what they will do and trusting in that? Do you find those effective?
Sure. Yeah, well, there's hundreds of personality tests. So, there's the first category of personality tests are those that are really designed for clinical assessments of people that have mental illness. So the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, for example, is a test designed for clinical diagnosis of people that have specific mental problems. Unfortunately, a lot of companies have hired psychologists to come in and they'll administer the MMPI to managers and make decisions, and they'll often do it for hiring top managers. There's a number of personality traits that the MMPI is good at identifying, but really the test was designed for people to determine a difference between somebody who's in the normal range on those characteristics versus somebody who's in the abnormal range. And so using the test to decide whether somebody's somewhere in the normal range, but in a different point on the normal range, may or may not be appropriate for hiring purposes and so forth. But they're still doing it. So I, can't, obviously organizations are free to do what they want with that, but there's to a certain extent probably inappropriate. There's a whole bunch of other personality tests that can be used for development purposes. And so
what about the DISC assessment?
Myers-Briggs is another one that a lot of organizations use. And so these can be used in a training setting. So you give people these Myers-Briggs tests and they kind of rate their judgment versus intuition, and there's 4 or 5 different categories that are part of those tests. And as I said, there's a lot of them on problem-solving style and communication styles and so forth. So what those tests are good for is sort of identifying, what are my tendencies as a person? Do I tend to be more judgmental or more intuitive about how I make decisions about people? And if I'm kind of too far over on the judgment scale, maybe I need to recognize that in myself. And when I find myself in a situation where I have to make a decision, maybe I should stop for a second and say, all right, what am I doing here? Am I using this tendency that I have to make this decision? So these can be used then as kind of a tool for personal development. They also can be used for team development. If you have a team that has a lot of diverse personality styles, then how is that affecting team dynamics? Could be a good thing to have a lot of diverse styles. On the other hand, if everybody in the team has the same style, then they may be making a lot of mistakes about not bringing in outside opinions and so forth. And so you can use those personality tests to kind of help the team develop itself into kind of seeking out other kinds of inputs. So in answer to your question, I have no problem with personality tests if they're used appropriately. On the other hand, if you are using them for hiring decisions without actually going through the formal validation processes that psychologists should do for tests, then you're probably using them inappropriately.
No, that makes perfect sense. And the last question that I want to ask, because we're coming up on that hour, is: do you feel, in your experience and in your opinion, do you feel like business mindset, is that something people are just born with, or that's something that can be like cultivated and developed?
Well, it's the old nurture-nature argument, right? Certainly, there are people born with tendencies to be organized, to set goals for themselves. If you look at a lot of these studies that have been done on twins, separated at birth, they oftentimes will exhibit a lot of the same characteristics. So, there's certainly, I think, innate characteristics, personality characteristics that people kind of inherit from their genetic background. On the other hand, if you grow up in a house where people are organized and people set a lot of goals for themselves and so forth, then you probably are going to exhibit some of those same characteristics when you get out into the world and start behaving yourself. Whether you're in business or in any kind of setting, those personality characteristics are probably going to be carried with you. I think, though, nurture is really important. You look at households that have strong academic backgrounds. I know from my own personal experience, all my kids grew up expecting to go to college, and they all have advanced master's degrees and so forth. So I look at other families where they don't have those kinds of experiences, and they don't have the expectation their kids are going to go to college and get advanced degrees and so forth. So that nurture part, I don't think my kids are any smarter than anybody else's kids, but they had that nurture from their family experiences that led to those kind of outcomes. So
no, I agree, and I agree in the power of expectations. You're right. It was a study. I forgot the actual name of it, but they did it on teachers, and they basically told, a certain group of teachers, like, yo, you're getting all just straight A students at the highest intellectual levels possible. Then they told another group of people, oh, you're getting, the worst students that don't really have a high aptitude of learning. Yeah. But inside, the students were just randomized. They wasn't really the label that the teachers thought. And surprisingly, the teacher who thought she had the best students, all of the students exhibited the best behavior just because it was an expectation that they all were basically geniuses and had the highest intellectual abilities. But in actuality, they were just normal students. But the expectation that the teacher was given was different. So I agree completely, and that is powerful. So to close it out, is there any parting words that you want to give to the people, and then also any thing that you're currently doing that you want to bring light to, or anything that you're currently supporting that you want to give light to right now?
Sure. Well, one thing I always told students at sort of whenever I had a chance to kind of impart my wisdom, so to speak. And the thing I always tell people and students and anybody I talk to is be a yes person. You'll have more opportunities in life by saying yes to things than ignoring opportunities and saying no to things. So since I've retired, I'll just kind of give me the opportunity to talk about that a little bit. I always was engaged in a lot of activities in the community, volunteer activities in the community. And so at this point, I've now on two different boards, on the Indianapolis Habitat for Humanity board. I had worked for Habitat for Humanity in Muncie when I was at Ball State for a number of years, but now I'm on the board for Indianapolis Habitat for Humanity. I'm also on the board for the Indiana Council on World Affairs, and so I'm participating in that. And so this gives me an opportunity to kind of use kind of the skills I've had. So right now we're conducting a strategic planning process for the Indiana Council on World Affairs. And so that's something I did for a lot of not-for-profit organizations back when I was working. And so I get to carry that kind of skill with me into my retirement and actually do some of those same things again. Joined the Carmel Rotary Club here. I live in Carmel, Indiana now, and I'm doing a lot of volunteer activities with them. So I think no matter where you are in life, that you have to kind of step out of your kind of comfort zone and say yes to things and engage in activities that are going to keep you busy, and not just keep you busy, but give you an opportunity to contribute to the betterment of your community.
And just to even show testament to that, when I had asked Ray to come on the podcast, he had said he had never done it before, but he said yes to the opportunity, came on here, and then giving back to his community. So I just appreciate you for actually living the words that you're giving to people. I appreciate you giving your experience, your thoughts, your insights. Definitely appreciate you for coming on, being a rising tide. Again, the purpose of Rising Tide is to educate, heal, and empower by bringing on the world's most brilliant minds and purest souls. So again, we were honored to have Brother Ray Montagno here to just shed light on wisdom when it comes to sales, marketing, and management. So until next time, appreciate you for being a rising tide.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right, take care.